Good afternoon, everybody. Goedemiddag allemaal. Welkom weer voor onze mini-college met professor Dan Schueftan. Welcome back. Some of you back, some of you new to us. We're welcoming you to in our mini-college given by Professor Dan Schueftan, who is the head of the International Graduate Program at the Haifa University on International Security. He also teaches in the Tel Aviv University about security issues, and he has published numerous books about subjects related to the Israeli politics and security issues in regard to the region where Israel is situated. Today, he will talk about some of Israel's neighbors, and we will keep the formula as we did the former 2 times. Professor Schueftan will talk for about 30-35 minutes. You are all very much invited to pose questions. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a button saying Q&A. You're welcome to write your questions there. Please keep the questions short. That will make it easier for me to present them, because of course I have to read them and structure some of the questions regarding different subjects. You can start posing your questions now, but obviously some of your questions will be answered during the lecture. Dan will talk again for 30-35 minutes, after which we will start the Q&A. Dan, thanks very much for joining us again. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, if you remember, our first session was about politics and society, focusing on the Israeli society. The second was on economy and related issues concerning Europe, because it is the most important trade partner of Israel. And now we're going to discuss security and actually discuss 2 separate issues. One by far more important than the other, the first by far more important than the second. But I'm sorry to say that I already expect that most of your question will be about the less important, because it is more interesting for people in Europe, and they believe it's much more important than it actually is. But let me start by something that is existential for Israel and is extremely important to understand. And this is the confrontation with Iran. The first thing we need to understand about Iran, that unlike the Arab world, that is basically a failure, and there's not much hope about the Arab in Iran. It is a very that can mobilize itself and can fit into the modern world. And as I said, one day when they get rid of this barbaric regime, this can be perhaps the best ally of Israel in the Middle East. But you know, future allies doesn't really change the way you deal with them in war. Remember, today, Germany and Japan are the allies of the United States, but in order to make them allies, you had to burn Berlin and to throw atom bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They didn't get up one day during the Nazi time or the radicals in Japan and said, hey, let's be friends. They became allies only after a barbaric regime was destroyed in Berlin and in Tokyo, and then you can speak to them about allies. But the society in Iran is very, very impressive. So they would be very helpful friends, but they're also extremely dangerous enemies. Now, why are they enemies? I mean, we have no common border with the Iranians. There is nothing in particular that the Iranians want from us or we from them. So we should have been in excellent relations. And this was true until the revolutionary regime came 41 years ago. And what they have against Israel are two issues, and when they combine, it is very, very powerful. They have an ideological, anti-Semitic idea of destroying the Jews, and this is very serious. I'll come back to it in a moment. And they have a strategic interest that if I were an Iranian supporting this regime, I would also say that undermining Israel is a very important Iranian strategic objective. It makes a lot of strategic sense. Let me discuss both elements. First of all, the ideological one. The Iranians are really hated this regime and people who support this regime. They consider Jews to be the enemies of humanity. I know that it sounds ridiculous and it's very difficult to understand in the modern world, but remember, the Nazis were also living in the modern world, and you had them even when they needed every train for military purposes. When they were in their worst military situation, they used it to transport Jews. So there is a level of hatred that explains also strategic elements. This is not just a propaganda ploy. This is very, very serious. To give you only an example, recently, Khamenei, the supreme leader, spoke about the corona problems in Iran, and he spoke about the combination between human problems and problems of the devil and having genes or having, the kind of supernatural elements. And then in his own sight, you had an explanation that the Jews are working together with the devil. And when they say devil, they don't mean it metaphorically. They mean the devil. In their world, this is very real. And I would seriously consult everybody to take the ideological level seriously. But the more immediate concern is strategic. And to understand why Iran considers Israel to be an enemy, you must understand what the strategy of Iran is and what the ambitions of this regime are. And the ambition is to hegemonize the Middle East. The Iranians look at the Middle East, at the Arab states. All of them are in very bad shape. Some of them are crumbling. Others are very, very weak. And Iran believes that because of the balance of power and the historic role of Iran, they can dominate the whole region and become a world power. Not a superpower, perhaps, but a regional power on the level that will play a major role also on the global scene. And they are working on it in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, with quite considerable success. And this is their plan, and this is what they want to do. They're very sophisticated. They're doing it through proxies. They're working together with Shiites everywhere, but they're willing even to work with radical Sunnis if it is against Israel. For instance, Iran is the radical Shia, the Muslim Brothers are the radical Sunnah, but Hamas, the Muslim Brothers in Gaza, and Iran are cooperating against Israel. So they are capable of using very unlikely proxies, and it works very well, again, because they're very, very sophisticated. And they believe that once they control the whole region, the oil, the strategic passages, perhaps Mecca one day, so they'll have even a greater impact in Islam because the Shiites are a minority in Islam and they need to become significant also for Sunnis. And if they succeed in doing it, then they can spread the revolution. And this is, again, another thing that we need to understand. This is a revolutionary regime. They're not interested in the status quo and some improvements. They're interested in changing the balance of power in a radical way. And so far, they have succeeded to a considerable extent. The only thing that can stop them is Israel. Israel with American support, but primarily Israel. Because if they dominate the Middle East, Israel will be in existential danger. And Israel will do what it takes to prevent them from hegemonizing the Middle East, because otherwise Israel will go back to the situation that it was not in since May, June 1948. We have never been in an immediate danger to the very existence of the state of Israel, where you can destroy Israel. If the Iranians hegemonize the region, this will be the reason. This will be the situation. And therefore, Israel is willing to do and is already doing quite a lot in order to prevent the Iranians from getting there. The Iranians know it. So in addition to the ideological element, there is also the strategic element, and the combination of the two is extremely strong. Now, when they try to do it, they understand that if, for instance, they manage to take over more and more Arab states, Israel will use its military force, and Israel is the only regional element that can fight the Iranians, that is strong enough to stop the Iranians, that is stronger, as a matter of fact, than Iran. And therefore, they're trying to threaten Israel in a way that Israel will be not able to act before it's too late. They already have about 130,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon. They want to bring in to Syria and to Western Iraq, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of missiles. Iran itself already has missiles for 2,000 kilometers with a very heavy payload that can hit Israel, and they have close to 1,000 of them. They're trying now to build an infrastructure in Syria to make the rockets into missiles in Lebanon. In other words, today you have a very large number of rockets that are inaccurate in Lebanon, and they want to make them accurate, to bring in factories to Syria or to Lebanon, where simple rockets, stupid rockets, become smart, accurate rockets, which makes them far, far more dangerous to Israel. And then even the fact that Israel has the best anti-ballistic system and the best anti-missile system in the world, it can be saturated. I mean, it cannot deal with hundreds of thousands of projectiles. This is impossible for any country in the world. So they will be in a position where thousands of heavy missiles can land very accurately throughout Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, in the centers of population, on electricity plants, on desalination plants, on everything in Israel. This in itself will not destroy Israel, but it may undermine the Israeli success story. Because a country like Israel depends on export, a country like Israel depends on being an international hub of technology. If you have here a state of war on a major scale for a long time, Israel cannot continue to thrive, to succeed, and therefore also to exist. And this is what they want to do. And what Israel is doing today, 2-3 times every week, we are at war with Iran. We have a preventive war, a low-intensity preventive war with Iran, which is going on 2 times, 3 times a week, and is also combined with clandestine measures, intelligence, and what have you. Recently also cyber war. The Iranians have tried to poison water inside Israel. Israel is reportedly responsible for demonstrating to them in the port of Bandar Abbas that they can't afford it because Israel is a cyber superpower and can do many things to Iran if the Iranians go too far. And we are at war. It is a low-intensity war. It is not directly with the Iranian mainland. It is not being waged in Iran, but it is waged in Syria and in Western Iraq on a very considerable level. It is still not an all-out war, but on a very considerable level. At the moment, the Iranians are losing this war. And the Iranians are losing this war because of a combination of 4 or 5 elements. First of all, it is close to Israel and far from Iran, so militarily, Israel is in a better position to deal with it and is dealing with it in an effective way. Second, on the international level, we have the support of the United States at the moment, and a very substantial support. And we have a good arrangement with the Russians, who don't want Iran to take over Syria for their own reasons, and who are willing to allow Israel to do a lot of things in Syria because Israel is not undermining what is the most important for Russia, namely the Assad regime. So we don't touch what is very important for them. They don't touch what is very important for us. And for the time being, we are doing well. But in addition to it, there is also a consensus among most Arab Sunni states that they're so afraid of Iran that they are willing to support Israel, not directly, but when they take their own steps in their own interest, they are in line with the interests of Israel and the United States. So at the moment, it is a coalition of America, Israel, Sunni Arab states that is very effective. And let me say one more thing, and I know that this is something that Europeans don't like to hear. One of the major reasons that there is no all-out war, that the Iranians are not responding, is because Trump is the president, and the Iranians know that Trump will support Israel. If you have Biden, or when you had Obama, it was a different story altogether. Not that the United States would be against Israel, but it would be controlling the Israeli response in a way that is very helpful for Iran, because this administration, the Obama administration, and probably if we have Biden, also the Biden administration, want to come closer to Iran like the Europeans. So the Europeans don't count in the Middle East, so this is not a major problem for Israel, but Trump considers Iran to be an enemy, an all-out enemy of the United States, and Trump is weakening Iran, and I think this is the best possible strategy from the American point of view, not to go to war, not to bombard anything, but to try to undermine the Iranian economy, and this is working very well. And Iran is in very bad shape because of the combination of American sanctions, the collapse of the price of oil, and the corona. We don't know exactly how deep the corona has struck Iran, but to all realistic reports, quite deep. So at the moment, Israel is in a very good position, but Israel must prepare itself for a situation where Iran may again have hopes concerning the next step. And let me emphasize one thing which is very important to understand about Iran. The nuclear option of Iran, the attempt to get nuclear weapons, is not in order to use it in war. It is not they get a bomb, they fly to Israel, they drop it on Tel Aviv, and game over. This is not their strategy. They're far smarter than that. They want a nuclear arsenal in order to have impunity, in order to be able to be immune against escalation by Israel and by the United States, fearing that if the Israelis or the Americans escalate, the result will be nuclear. And Israel must escalate in order to win. The United States, if it comes to military action, must escalate. So that it doesn't come to military action, the best way is to use economic measures so that Iran is weakened. A weak Iran is much less of a danger. So while the newspapers and everyday discussions, and Europe, of course, which always deals with issues that are much less important than other issues that it is afraid to touch, and everybody wastes its time over the Palestinians, the real issue, 100 times more important than all the Palestinians and even the Arabs put together, is Iran. And this is where the center of gravity of Israel is. Now, even if some of you disagree with my analysis here, which is the analysis of the mainstream of Israelis, you should take into account that this is how Israelis think. Israelis see Iran first and everything else later. So it's much more important to understand, if you want to understand the Israeli behavior, to understand the Iranian issue rather than the Palestinian issue. Having said all that, let me now say a few things about the Palestinian issue, and I'm sorry to say that I expect that most of your questions will be on the less important issue rather than the more important issue. You need to make a distinction in the Palestinian issue between two foci. If the focus is on how important are the Palestinians in the Middle East, the answer is zero. Their impact is zero. They have no impact on the Middle East. The Europeans tell themselves this kind of fairy tale that if you bring in peace between Israelis and the Palestinians, the Middle East will be stable, the Middle East will be peaceful. This is complete nonsense. I mean, it doesn't even have a grain of truth. Not only is it not true, it doesn't even have a grain of truth. It used to be, the Palestinian issue used to be significant, not very significant, but significant. It lost in the last decade most of its significance. Arabs don't care. Will they make statements? Yes. Will they take steps that will try to show how they have solidarity with the Palestinians? Yes. Can some of these steps get out of control? Yes. But is it in any way significant concerning the stability of the Middle East? Zero. I mean, not even minute. Zero. Zero impact. On the other hand, from an Israeli point of view, to get out of most of the West Bank is a very important issue. And we have a disagreement in Israel, but I think you have a majority of Israelis who don't want to control the Palestinians in the West Bank. We already got rid of the Palestinians in Gaza. We have no peace. We will have no peace. Peace is not an option, but at least we don't sit in the Gaza Strip. It's an enemy. From time to time, you have to hit them. There is no solution, but at least they're not part of us. They're not part of the state of Israel. And that's the greatest danger that you can possibly imagine. When it comes to the West Bank, because of the fact that so many Israelis live together with the Palestinians, it is a major problem for Israel in the sense that if you want a Jewish and democratic state, you must get out of the mainland in the West Bank, of the heartland of the West Bank. Namely, you can incorporate in Israel settlement blocks, and all the settlement blocks put together are approximately 6 to 7% of the West Bank. So it's not a problem to have the rest of it under Palestinian control in terms of where Israeli settlements are, because these settlements are in these settlement blocks. 80% of the settlers live in these settlement blocks. But to get out of the heartland, where you have only a relatively small number of settlers, is something that, in my view, and many Israelis, I think perhaps most Israelis agree, this is a very important issue. How do you get out? Now, some of us had the fantasy that when we get out, we will get peace. I think most Israelis understand today that it's a fantasy, and I'll explain in a moment why. But now the question is, should we annex the settlement blocks? Should we annex the Jordan Valley? Should we apply Israeli citizenship on the Jordan Valley or the settlement blocks? This is one question, and I have one answer to it. And then there is another question, should we apply Israeli settlement, Israeli sovereignty to each and every Israeli settlement in the West Bank, including those in the middle of the territory that, built on the Trump plan, is to become one day a Palestinian non-sovereign state? Now, here you must understand two things, because what is on the table now is the Trump plan. Can you have any kind of compromise that Israelis and Palestinians can agree to? No, zero. The chances were zero in the past, are zero at the present, and will be zero in the near future unless the Palestinians turn into Norwegians. If you look at the real Palestinians, not the fantasies that some people in Europe have, and some people in America have, an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian national movement is impossible. A, because the Palestinians are not willing to legitimize a Jewish state in Israel. They insist on the so-called right of return, namely, first we get something and then we will destroy you from the inside through demography. And the Palestinians have proven not to be a partner for any kind of compromise. In 2008, Olmert offered them everything they say that they want, and they rejected it. They rejected everything else. They think they can impose on Israel their terms, which would be terrible, unacceptable to Israel. The possibility of reaching an Israeli-Palestinian agreement are exactly zero, have been zero. And therefore, the Oslo process was a mistake, not because of the concessions, but because there is no partner. In terms of concessions, I went beyond Rabin. Okay, this was not the problem. But even Rabin, in his last speech in the Knesset, gave more or less the same conditions that Netanyahu is giving today. And the Palestinians will not accept it, and they have not accepted much less than what Rabin demanded, and much less for us, much more for them than Rabin demanded, so the chances are zero. Because an agreement is impossible, the only way I see is unilateralism. In other words, Israel getting out of most of the West Bank without an agreement with the Palestinians. This will require two things. One is to root out at least 70,000 Israelis from the heartland of the West Bank. It's very, very, very difficult. And at the moment, we don't have a government that has the leadership to do it. And by the way, when I say at the moment, I don't mean just Netanyahu. I also look at all the alternatives in Israel to Netanyahu and in all the Israeli political structure. Unfortunately, we don't have this kind of leadership. We had it with Ariel Sharon, and when he died, really something very serious happened to Israel, because he was the person, the last person who could have done it. Perhaps one day we will have another leader of his caliber, I don't know, but at the moment, if you look at the entire spectrum, it is absolutely vacant, okay? Netanyahu could have tried, but it's not in his character to do it, and the others are not even an option. They will not be taken seriously by Israelis. And I don't mean the extreme right, but the mainstream of Israelis. So at the moment, we don't have the leadership for it, and I'm sorry. And my plan looks great, and I wrote a book about it more than 20 years ago, and I love my plan, but I have to realistically look at reality and say, at the moment, it cannot be done. But we can prepare the groundwork for this approach, and I think the best way at the moment would be to apply Israeli sovereignty on the Jordan Valley. There is nobody of any consequence in Israel who thinks that you can let the Palestinians control the Jordan Valley, because they know they will use it not to help themselves, but to hurt us. This is what practically everybody of any significance in Israel knows. Nobody suggests letting the Palestinians control it. The question is, can you leave the question open? And I think that if you want to make the ability to get out of most of the West Bank more realistic, then you need to close the door for Palestinians, for a Palestinian state, to connect with radicals east of Israel, be it Iran, or one day Iraq, or Syria, or if you have a different regime in Jordan, whoever is east of Israel, if the Palestinians have free access to the Arab world, they will not use it for themselves, they will use it against Israel. For 100 years, this is exactly what they have done. This is why they have always taken the wrong turn throughout their history. There isn't a single time where they took the right turn, because they always gave precedence to hurting Israel over helping themselves. So when you block this in the Jordan Valley, then the possibility of getting out of most of the West Bank becomes more realistic. Is it immediately realistic? No, I'm sorry to say. But in terms of the realistic alternatives today, this is what I would do. But what is important to understand for Europeans beyond this specific question, and we may argue on it, and some of my best friends disagree with me, and we have interesting arguments here on the substance, but there is one fundamental thing that you must understand. The European obsession with the Palestinians, the conditioning of the relationship between Israel and Europe with making the Palestinians happy, is something that is a dead end. The Palestinians will never be happy. It's impossible to make them happy. And anybody who challenges this must go back and learn something, okay? There are fundamental issues that if you disagree with, you must learn something, because this is today, with the experience we have, not an interesting discussion, okay? So if the Europeans come and say, we must do it with the consent of the Palestinians, what they actually mean, you can't do anything because the Palestinians will not give you your consent. The Palestinians cannot be a partner. And unfortunately, this is the situation. By the way, this is not new. In 1948, Ben Gurion worked with King Abdullah of Jordan because he couldn't work with the Palestinians. And practically everybody around Ben Gurion, including the most moderate Moshe Sharet, agreed with it because the Palestinian national movement is not capable, ripe, at least in this generation, to make any kind of historic compromise. They reject the foundation of any historic compromise. Now, am I concerned in terms of security by the Palestinians? Yes. They can shoot rockets from Gaza, and then we will have to hit them again. But my assumption, and the assumption of most Israelis, is that my grandchildren, my grandchildren will be fighting in Gaza. People who expect peace in Gaza don't know what they're talking about, okay? It's unpleasant, it's a problem, but it's a problem you can live with for the next 3,000 years. It's unpleasant, it's difficult, it kills people. But let me tell you one very interesting thing. In spite of the fact that this is a situation in the Gaza Strip and Israelis understand it, nevertheless, you cannot find today a free place in the areas in Israel that are around the Gaza Strip. Only recently, 1,200 Israeli families joined this region that is around Gaza, a few kilometers from Gaza, knowing that one day we have a war in the north, and once in the east, and once in the south, and you will have radicals here and radicals here, and still you have a very good life in Israel. So this is something that is extremely unpleasant, but it's not dangerous, and it's not impossible to live with. In the West Bank, for all the future that one can think of realistically, we will have a hostile neighbor that will try to undermine us. Again, it's a problem, it's unpleasant, you have to deal with it, the Europeans will always suggest the wrong thing. Okay, you can learn to live with it. It is important for Israel not to incorporate 2.5 million Palestinians in Israel, and therefore creating the conditions that will make it possible for Israel to get out of there unilaterally is important. Let me sum up, because we have exactly 2 more minutes to the 35 that I was asked to speak, and say the following. Israel has serious security problems. No other democratic open nation has had problems of this magnitude for so long. We are dealing with it for 140 years. And by the way, my expectation is also for the next 140 years. Is it pleasant? No. Is it manageable? Yes. And you must understand the overall context. In the Middle East, what people do is to kill their neighbors. Okay? For the last 100 years, have the Arabs all around Israel built their nations and prepared them for the 20th century, for the 21st century? No, very little, if anything. Okay? So therefore, they cannot meet the challenges of the 21st century, and everything around us is crumbling. But they have invested millions of billions of dollars on fighting each other and on fighting us, primarily on fighting each other. This is a very, 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 very violent area. This is a structurally unstable area. Can you make parts of it more stable? Yes. Less violent? Yes. Our agreement with Egypt is extremely important and very successful. And it with Jordan, very much so. And is it possible that we will do it with another state and another state? Yes. And is it worth making concessions for it? Yes. No problem. The point is that whatever you do, there are elements that are more radical that will still fight you. Today, we are not challenged by the Egyptian army, but Hezbollah, a non-state organization, has 130,000 rockets and missiles directed to the centers of population of Israel. So you live in an area which is violent. People who speak about peace in the Middle East must have read too many fairy tales. Ja, wie sich das der kleine Moritz vorstellt. It's a joke. You must be joking if you speak about peace in the Middle East. This is not what will happen in the near future. In a few generations, perhaps. When the Messiah comes, I'm certain, but not in the foreseeable future. And the overwhelming majority of Israelis understand it. And when people come from Europe and try to lecture us about peace, we're trying to be polite. This is the best you can be under these circumstances. So there are very serious security problems, and they're manageable. Israel is strong enough to deal with them. On this happy note, let me perhaps stop here and open the floor for whoever wants to comment or ask questions.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. I think some of us are still in shock because of your statements.
I hope so.
Indeed, in Europe, we do hope that the world will learn from the European experience and try to establish peace and see the advantages of peace. Interestingly enough, most of the questions which have already been asked are about Iran. So we will start with some issues about Iran, and I hope in due time people will add more questions, maybe also about the other question, the other subtopic. There is a question about the difference between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime. Is the difference very big? And do you think that the Iranian people is just as hostile to Israel, sees it as well as a Satan as the regime does? What will happen if and when? Is it an option that the regime will collapse? What will happen then? Who can take their place?
Let me first respond to something that you have said, that they will learn from Europe. When they will become Europeans, they will learn from Europe. In other words, when Saddam Hussein and Assad and Arafat become Florence Nightingale and Albert Schweitzer, then they can consider it. Europe is an enormous success, a human success of the greatest magnitude in terms of what it did with itself. But the application of the European experience to other cultures, particularly the kind of cultures we have in the Middle East, is, I'm not saying forever impossible, but not for this generation, not for people who were brought up in the Middle East as it is today. If somebody wants, I'm willing to go more into details about it. Let me respond now to the Iranian question. First of all, to the best of our knowledge, it's very difficult to assess it, but to the best of our knowledge, we have at least a third of the Iranians who support this regime. We are speaking about people who knew nothing else. Remember, Iran is a relatively young society, and this regime is in power for 40 years, and it is a totalitarian regime. So you're exposed only to what the regime wants you to be exposed. But in spite of it, you have a very strong element of Iranians who are not only not hating Israel, but even loving Israel. Not only not hating the United States, but even loving the United States. It's a very strong element in the Iranian society. Can they bring down the regime? I don't think so. By the way, when they tried in 2009, Obama did nothing to even encourage them. I'm not saying involvement, but to even encourage them. But these people are there, and I don't think there is a deep hostility in the Iranian society. I think that in some Arab societies that have peace agreements with Israel, there is more hostility than the Iranian society has vis-a-vis Israel. If this regime is replaced, I don't think he will have a major problem with its own society, and very soon we will have very good relations between Israel and Iran. I have no doubt about it whatsoever. I'm not an expert on the Iranian society, but to every expert that I've spoken on the subject, he says more or less the same. Concerning the ability to bring the regime down, we don't know. Did anybody know that Russia will collapse at the end of the 1980s? Did anybody in Egypt on the eve of the Arab Spring know that Mubarak is about to lose his position? 46,000 Egyptian agents were out there, and they were asked, when is there a danger to the regime? Not only their livelihood dependent on them, their lives depended on them. And 46,000 people who live in Egypt, who know the Egyptians who did it, didn't know when. I'll tell you more than that. I've met the activists of Tahrir Square. They didn't know. Okay? These things sometimes gather momentum when you don't expect it to gather momentum. And people who say that they can predict it must be reading in tea leaves or something, because anything analytical will not lead you there.
Okay. Some people think that the Arab regimes at the moment have very weak leaders, weak states, and they wonder whether this fact of being weak states is part of the problem of the instability of the Middle East, especially in relation to Iran. And do you expect that stronger regimes will make a difference, will change the map?
The question is, what are you talking about? Are you talking about weak regimes, weak leaders, or weak societies? Look, Sisi in Egypt is not a weak leader. He's a very strong leader. He's a military dictator. He is very strong in Egypt, and he is not a vegetarian. But Egypt, with more than 100 million people, can fit very well into the 19th century, not even the 20th century, let alone the 21st century, because the Egyptian society is incapable of dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. Many elements, let me give you only two that I consider to be the most important. The attitude to pluralism, that is also the precondition for science and technology. The attitude towards women. You lose 50% of the human potential, or almost 50% of the human potential. Say that you have some exceptions with women. So I don't think that they can deal with it, and there isn't a single Arab state. Look, you can look at the states in the Persian Gulf, very small states, and you will find there some positive elements, but on the other hand, most of their work is done by foreign workers. So most of the population are not citizens. They come from Thailand and from Pakistan and from throughout the world, from India. And this is not a viable structure when the people themselves are not those who generate what the society does. It's a combination of oil and foreign workers. So no, I don't think there is a chance. And I'm saying it with sorrow. Even as an Israeli, I wish that Egypt would be in a much better position. It would have been enormously important for Israel if Jordan were in a better position, okay? So even looking at it through the narrow lens of Israeli interest, it is much more important for us to have them in a good shape than in bad shape. Perhaps you could say in the 50s and the 60s, it would have been a problem for us because these countries were at war with us. But now that we have peace with Jordan and Egypt, I certainly would have liked to see Jordan and Egypt in a much better situation. I don't see it coming. I would like to see more stability in the Middle East, even in countries that are hostile to Israel, but I don't see it coming in the foreseeable future because of the flaws of Arab society.
Thank you. Some questions regarding Iran's influence and how does it, does Iran have any significant influence in Jordan, and where would Israel draw the line? And I add to this, how does Israel manage the threat of Hezbollah, Iranian proxy?
First of all, in Jordan, I don't know of any major role that the Iranians have because the Jordanian regime considers it to be an enemy, or at least a serious adversary. But in Jordan, the problem is that you have two parts of the society that are easily radicalized. The first are Palestinians and the other are members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So at the moment, I don't see an immediate danger in Jordan of becoming Syria or Iraq or Lebanon in terms, or Yemen in terms of Iranian influence. But once it comes to Jordan, Israel will have to intervene, and I would guess intervene militarily, because this would be a major danger to Israel. Having a strong buffer state in Jordan of a country that is not radical is a very important Israeli interest. Concerning Hezbollah, on the one hand, Hezbollah is a major threat because it possesses weapons that can reach Israeli centers of population in numbers that make it impossible to prevent serious damage. The response of Israel to Hezbollah using these rockets and missiles will be devastating Lebanon. And the only reason we haven't had war in 14 years is that Hezbollah knows that Israel is determined to do it. Let me put it this way. If, God forbid, Israel would listen to 5 minutes of European approaches, we would have had war. Because the only reason that there is no war is deterrence, and the only reason there is deterrence is that we are non-Europeans. In other words, that Hezbollah understand that we are not only strong, but also determined. And if we are threatened, we will not have an international conference with the international community and have a discussion over Article 46, but we will bring devastation to Lebanon. And that's the only reason there is no war with Lebanon. And by the way, if it breaks out, when it breaks out, then it's very important that everybody in the Arab world will see terrible outcome, because the only reason you can exist in the Middle East is if people are afraid of you. Now, you can isolate elements in the Arab world and to say, you don't have to be afraid of us on the basis of everyday action because you're on our side. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, we will give you water, we will give you gas, we will help you in your security problems, what have you. And we're doing it. But the reason that they're not changing their policy is that they know that if they change their policy, Israelis are not Europeans. Not being European is perhaps the most important thing in the Middle East.
Well, I want to ask some questions about the second topic, the Palestinians. Somebody is asking, how does the Palestinian on the street, not the leaders, but the Palestinian on the street, feel about Israeli presence in the West Bank? How do they feel about the alleged plans of annexation? And how would they react to, for example, a unilateral retreat of Israel and a unilateral building of a Palestinian state? And how would you react to that?
Well, there is a dual attitude. There is a dissonance that is very typical of what you have throughout the Arab world and other parts of the world vis-a-vis America and Israel. Admiration and wanting to benefit on the one hand, extreme hostility and letting the radicals speak in your name on the other. Let us start with Arab citizens of Israel who have a very, very good life in Israel based on their testimony. Nevertheless, they elect leaders who are very, very, very radical against the legitimacy of the very existence of a Jewish state and constantly support every enemy of Israel you can possibly think of. And there is a dissonance. Both parts are genuine. On the one hand, they want to benefit from Israel. On the other hand, they want to blame Israel for practically everything, and they're willing to support people who fight Israel. And the two cohabitate. It is not as if one of these parts is genuine and the other part is not. Both are genuine. This is what you call dissonance. You sometimes have it within one person in his attitudes, but here it is the collective. On the one hand, people in the West Bank know that without Israel, they are in a terrible, terrible situation. For instance, when you work in Israel, you make 5 to 7 times as much as if you do the same work in the West Bank. To give you only one example. If Israel would not have controlled the West Bank, it would have been controlled by Hamas. And the reality in the West Bank would be like in Syria, where Arabs kill Arabs in hundreds of thousands. There would be, in an economic situation, much worse than you have today in Lebanon, where the situation is catastrophic, economically speaking. If Israel would not protect the Palestinian Authority from Hamas, Hamas would take over, make war with Israel. Israel would respond in a way that will hurt them 100 times more than they're hurt today. So, on one level, they understand that the Israeli occupation is good. On the other level, they don't want to be occupied. And on the third level, which is the most important, they only support leaders who make an agreement with Israel impossible. And here, there are differences between Arafat and Abu Mazen, but not on the fundamental issue of having a final historical compromise where you have a Jewish state next to an Arab state, and the Arab state doesn't try to undermine the Jewish state. In this sense, everybody that counts among the Palestinians is the same. And they only support such leaders who demand the right of return, which means allow us to destroy you nicely by demographic means. Every Palestinian who's not a complete idiot knows that the right of return means the destruction of the state of Israel. And therefore, if you raise it in negotiations, you can't reach an agreement. They basically, this is a society whose livelihood is its victimhood. They play the victim. There are people in Europe who are stupid enough to finance them. Until recently, there were people in America who were stupid enough to finance them. They get billions of dollars. All of this money goes to corruption and to the sustaining of a system that is corrupt. None of it goes to building a system that will be self-sustainable. They don't even plan to be self-sustainable. They built on the assumption that stupid Europeans feel guilty about them and will give them a lot of money. And the entire structure is not productive. It is not something that gets help in order to get out of misery. It wants its misery to be financed and exhibited as victims. Do you have individual Palestinians who are very different? Yes. Do you have people who would want to be constructive? Yes. But their weight in the Palestinian society is almost non-existent. Let me give you the best example. The Palestinians had a prime minister, Salam Fayyad, a nation builder, their own Ben Gurion, a person who could have, not only could have, this is what he started doing, building the Palestinian society. I know Salam well on a personal level. I could reach an agreement with him in 10 minutes. The state of Israel could reach an agreement with him in 2 hours, okay, because he was a nation builder. The point is that this Salam Fayyad never got more than 2% of Palestinian support in his own society, in spite of the fact that he worked against corruption, because he worked against corruption, because he wanted to build a Palestinian society, never more than the support of 2%. And at the moment, he's trying to lay low, because if people forget about him, his life is safer. And a nation builder, he came from the World Bank, cannot build his nation because his nation doesn't want to be built. They want the products of a modern society. They're not willing to do the work of a modern society.
Dan, very briefly, because our time is actually finished, I want to add some things after you said, but there was a question about, is there any chance that Israel will unilaterally redraw from Palestinian and define a Palestinian state by itself? Just yes or no?
I hope very much, yes. But at the moment, it brings us back to what I said before concerning the leadership. A person who will do it will have to root out 70,000 Israelis from their homes. I think it should be done. I think the price we should pay, this is a price we should pay. I think it was a mistake not to do it 20 years ago, 40 years ago, when you realized you can't reach an agreement, work unilaterally. Our interest is not peace, because peace is not attainable. It is not realistic. If you want unicorns and rainbows, okay. But in the real world, what Israel needs is to cut itself off from the Palestinians. You cannot make them completely sovereign, because they will use their sovereignty against you. So you can't let them have the airspace, the electromagnetic space, the link to the Arab world without any kind of control. But anything they want to do that is not harming Israel, Israel would allow and could allow. This is what I advocate in Israel, but again, the leadership that is willing to pay the price without getting peace is at the moment not available.
Thank you. I wanted to point out for our audience three items which are publications of Sidi. The first of all is translation from Hebrew of a document written by General Redraw, which is called, I'll say it in Dutch, Israël's opties op de Westbank, terugtrekking, annexatie en conflict management. In that publication, he explains the two attitudes in Israel, I would say almost spagat, between the question of how can you maintain a democratic Jewish state on the one hand, and how can you look at security on the other hand. And he presents it by showing two camps and how they argue about these two subjects. I think it's a very interesting document. It's a report, quite long, but very well readable. And it's on our website. You can download it as a PDF for free.
Let me, if I may, add my recommendation to it. Yaki Amidror is a very serious Israeli. He was the National Security Advisor and one of the fine analysts and a very honest analyst, because very often when you have a political position, you also play with the analysis. Amidror doesn't do it, and I strongly recommend reading it.
This public.
Even when we disagree on something, Yaakov Amidror is always interesting to read.
Yes. Unfortunately, we also had a hard copy of this publication, but it's sold out, but you can download the PDF from our website. I also want to point out to a totally different publication, a translation of an article by Dori Gold, who explains the whole situation regarding the Jordan Valley and the strategic and historic situation regarding the Jordan Valley. And I think it gives a very extensive insight into the problematic around this area, which you only touched upon. And the same applies for a lecture we had with Einat Wilf, who again goes into another topic you only touched upon, and this is the question of the Palestinian refugee, and why this is a very crucial issue in the whole problem of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if I may say. What you only touched upon that, Dan. There was a whole lecture with Einat Wilf regarding this subject, and of course her book, which we also showed, which was just published in English.
Again, I want to strengthen your mentioning of it, and to also recommend, because this is a tremendously important issue, the right of return, and they did a very good work in this book, so I very strongly recommend that too.
Thank you very much. I also want to mention that we are going to have a lecture next week regarding the alleged plans of annexation, or whatever one should name them, because there are different ways of looking at this subject. Dan Tirza will show us different alternatives which are being discussed. And a week later, we will have a discussion with Dan Dijker about the way the population is regarding this question. But of course, we will publish more about that. Follow our calendar, follow our website for more publications, for more lectures. And of course, you can reach us for any questions you have. And Dan, I want to thank you very much for this lecture, for the previous two. I want to invite everybody to ask their friends in the Netherlands if they want to listen to this lecture in retrospect. It will be available on our website. Everybody's welcome to watch it again. And if you have any questions, any comments, you can reach to us and we can either answer them themselves or contact Dan for them. I also apologize for all those people who have not been, whose questions I couldn't have asked because of short of time. And I want only to mention that some people say that they don't agree with my statement, that Europeans are surprised at your statements. Some people agree with you totally, Dan. Some don't, some do, and that's very interesting. This is a free society, democratic society, and I still hope that sometimes the Middle East will learn how to live in peace. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. And Dan, again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.